Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today at Threads Cultural Conversations. Today, I'll be speaking with Zaib Shaikh, all the way from Los Angeles, California. Welcome, and thank you very much for joining us, Zaib.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate it. I also just wanted to acknowledge before we begin that I am in Los Angeles on the traditional grounds of the Tongva people, and we are indebted to the Tongva community for being caretakers of this land for generations, and we are their latest guests.
Thank you. It's really good to have you here today. So I'll start with a brief introduction. Zaib Shaikh is the Canadian Consul General in LA, California as of December 2018. But most people in Canada would actually know him as Amar Rashid, a popular character from the CBC series Little Mosque on the Prairies. So you've done some wonderful work in the past as an actor, and I know that you grew up in Toronto with parents who had immigrated to Canada from Pakistan. So why don't we begin with that a little bit? I'm really curious to learn more about your perceptions of other cultures around you while growing up in a city like Toronto.
You know, when you ask about a city like Toronto, of course, I grew up kind of in the mid 70s, late 70s. That was, you know, when I was sort of a super youngster growing up. And although Toronto, of course, is a city of super diversity these days. It was definitely a city of diversity back in those days, but not to the extent that we see now. And so while we had a very, I would say, global representation, you know, in terms of ethnicities, languages, colors of the people you saw on the street and in the schoolrooms, you were still all, especially as young people, I think, trying to actually not identify yourself as someone who's different. Everyone could already tell you were different than the quote unquote normal people. You know, you were, I had a strange name. I have a strange name still. It's sometimes hard for people to pronounce or even understand when they're reading it. There were other kids like that, kids, different religions, of course. And so I think all that makes for probably in any culture, to be honest, but definitely in a Canadian context, all of you are trying to be the same. You're not trying to actually be different. You're going out of your way to be the same. And so that's, I think, what I experienced. But even though I experienced that, I think all of us could tell that in a way we were living in a city and in a place that was very diverse. And that was the beauty about it.
Mm-hmm. That reminds me a lot of my own experiences growing up. So for myself, as a Pakistani Canadian growing up in Saskatchewan, Canada, I've always kind of felt the between spaces many times in my life. So I'd love to hear about what your experience has been like. And have you ever found yourself having to kind of navigate two different worlds, these two different cultures, and how did you manage or adapt to that?
I think I got lucky in the sense that it was a time when there was when really Canada had opened its doors to the world in a way for the first time, or not for the first time, I should say, but kind of for the first time in a new way after kind of a post-World War II kind of, and a post-World War I immigration kind of energy and influx and pattern. And so where you saw a lot of folks from the continent of Europe coming in a post-World War scenario, you saw a lot of people now coming into Canada, you know, from Asia and from Africa and even the Caribbean. You know, you grew up with people who were kids of people who were from those continents. And so you got a sense that we were all kind of navigating these different cultures and being two or three people, depending on who you were at home. You know, my parents were also from Pakistan. My grandparents were born in British India, of course. And then the partition happened. But I grew up in a household where one parent spoke to me kind of consistently in English, and then one parent spoke to me consistently in Urdu or Punjabi or another language so that I could really understand and start navigating the world with at least two languages. And so I don't know if that was a strict way of being brought up or an inventive way of being brought up, but it definitely made for me being a person who now can operate in a lot of ways, whether it's with people, in from the diaspora of the subcontinent, as people sometimes like to say, or whether it's obviously in a Western kind of Canadian, American, North American, even Western European kind of context. I feel myself, I'm very comfortable in both, in all of those arenas. And it was, of course, because of the place that I was born in, which was very welcoming, but also very kind of consciously, I feel part of the upbringing my parents wanted to give me, to make sure that I had a lot more going on than just an aspect of monoculture. It was there was a lot of duality, there was a lot of diversity, even in terms of my upbringing.
Yeah, it sounds like your early experiences were really related to diversity and inclusion, because you grew up around that, not only in the community, but your household as well. And then language, it's the same for me, where I grew up with parents speaking a little bit of English, a little bit of Urdu, a little bit of Punjabi. And so I grew up kind of with three different languages constantly in my head, and I'd have words to explain a feeling in Urdu, but maybe not in English, and vice versa. It's interesting how that happens. So would you say that you still have connections with your cultural roots in Pakistan?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I definitely feel that way. I don't know if I went to Pakistan or India, if they would, the people there would say I was connected from their point of view. But from my point of view, as a person who hasn't traveled there much, it's not like I go there on an annual basis or sort of am there repeatedly or many times over my life even. But because of the way I grew up, and because there are many more now people from places like that in Canada, in Toronto, you start getting a sense of the evolution of that culture, right? But I'd say I feel very connected. I certainly can navigate myself and communicate with others in that context. And I don't think I'd have any culture shock. But that's part of the beauty of being able to be a Canadian as well, where you don't have to give up yourself to be Canadian. In fact, you add yourself to become Canadian. And that's in some countries that you go around the world, you kind of have to erase yourself, or they do the erasing for you. And in Canada, while that may have been the history of Canada, it's definitely less of the present, and hopefully none of for its future, that it will only be a country that lets you be who you are to add to it, as opposed to give up yourself.
Absolutely. It's kind of like a best of both worlds situation.
Yeah, ideally.
So I guess that makes me very interested to learn more about whether your family influenced or impacted your career path in any way then, and like what your journey was like getting involved with theater.
Yeah, I mean, yes, they did. Inevitably, my parents were early sort of adapters of the media and entertainment space in Canada as immigrants. They were in a community, they were surrounded by a community that really didn't speak their language that they knew as their first language, but who were interested. And then they were seeing an influx as we move from kind of like, the mid 70s to the late 70s to kind of the early 80s. They're seeing, of course, an influx of people coming because Canada promises its doors open, but that they wants people from around the world to come and to help build the new Canada now. They saw that and they responded to that by actually creating some of the first radio and television shows in their language, in the language of Urdu, connecting back to, their motherland, if you will. And that idea, now we see it everywhere, right? Where there's so much, where it's proliferation of diverse networks and diverse shows and different language content that comes at us. But back in probably, 1977 out of Toronto, very few of those opportunities existed. So they really created those opportunities for others. And so I kind of grew up in that context, at least. Now, did my parents necessarily, think or want me to go into the entertainment world? I'm not sure about that. I think they were responding to their own realities. But my dad happens to be a poet from Pakistan, has written, books and collections of poetry, and has had his works adapted to become television shows in Pakistan on PTV, the kind of the public broadcasting, if you will. And so, they definitely understood that. But I think it was definitely a surprise when I sort of focused my next steps of living life in this arena. I don't think they thought I would be in the media and entertainment space, but they definitely didn't stop me from it. And I wouldn't necessarily say they encouraged me in the sense of as a kid, but once they knew I wanted to, yeah, I didn't get any discouragement.
I'm interested to know about how you first came across Little Mosque and what you thought about the premise of the show, and how was it any different than other projects that you'd taken up at that point in your career?
While Little Mosque came to me as most things do to most actors, kind of through the audition process. It's not that I was a star of any kind at that time. I was a theater actor, and so while I felt very proud of my work, and I had the good fortune of working with some great artists and in some great theater companies, the idea of sort of being on a TV show, you wouldn't just be offered one, at least not in my world, and not at that time. Again, we're speaking of a time prior to now. We have, so many television shows and films that have people of diversity as, main characters or main points of the story, or even written by people from many different cultures and languages back in the day. And I'm thinking not so long ago now, although I guess it is a long time ago. It doesn't feel that way, but it was that was very unique. And so this was a unique opportunity, but it came through a very traditional way, and through the way of my agent letting me know that this was an opportunity for me to audition for this character. And what was new about this thing that I was interacting with was that it was actually coming to me at a time when I really didn't know whether I was going to keep pursuing television and film. I was thinking I was going to maybe stay or go back to theater and stay in theater, because there was the idea that I could, be more of the human being that I wanted to see around on stages. That was more possible than seeing people like me on TV or films at that time, other than in very specific contexts. I'm speaking in a post 9/11 world. And so, it was either I was going to auditions where people wanted me to either be more Indian or be less Indian, or wondered if I should change my name, or a lot of auditions as well for like alien type characters, science fiction type. And I'm certainly not saying that that's not a worthy way, but when you feel like that's the only reason you're in the room, or those are the only opportunities you have, you start wondering whether this is the platform that you want to pursue your work in. And so this character came that was very different. Why? Because it was actually more kind of normal. It's a normal person who was attempting to do something kind of extraordinary, becoming a religious kind of figure, or taking on this idea of religious education to become a priest, obviously an imam in the Islamic context, but a priest in kind of a church-going context, wants to be the leader of a congregation. And yet he happens to be absolutely, North American. He's born in a big city in North America, Toronto, and because it was a Canadian show, but to play around the world, it could be any city like Toronto or New York, or maybe not Los Angeles, because we didn't show a lot of palm trees, but definitely kind of an East Coast city. And this person, it was almost like the idea was that it was a romantic comedy too. He was a romantic comedy lead, pursuing a kind of religious calling, but not because he happened to come from a religious family, and that's not why he was doing it. It was just that he was trying to do something bigger than himself and greater than himself, and it happened to be that this was an opportunity. So it's a very interesting character, a very human character, and a very relatable character, even though very different from me. But he wasn't an alien. He didn't have an accent, and he was around the age that I was, and that, funnily enough, was a very unique opportunity that I hadn't seen before in my career, other than in theater, really. And even in theater, it's already a little heightened, but in Shakespeare and otherwise. So it doesn't really feel like it's a modern, even though we can do modern interpretations of Shakespeare, doesn't really feel like a modern character or just a relevant character to your everyday life. And this character, in many ways, happened to be.
Mm-hmm. I remember just watching it and really taking in that uniqueness of the show and these characters, and just observing that representation of Muslim characters on Canadian media for the first time that I had seen. And I did think it was quite groundbreaking in a way. So what do you think about how Little Mosque has impacted overall public perceptions of Muslims? Because I think media can sometimes have two different types of effects. It can either break barriers or kind of reconfirm certain beliefs in a way, certain stereotypes maybe. So what do you think about Little Mosque's impact?
I definitely think it was in the former category of what you just said, Sameen. It was definitely a sort of a barrier breaker and a bridge builder. It was a show that ended up being in over 80 countries around the world. It ended up winning or being inducted into the Paley Center in the United States, both in New York and Los Angeles. It was featured on in the New York Times. When it premiered, it was a #1 kind of story item on BBC.org, even though it was a Canadian show. We went on to do about 100 episodes. I've ended up giving keynote lectures at places like Harvard, and have had this kind of energy from people around the world, whether it's New York or Johannesburg or London, UK, come up to me and people of not Muslim culture say assalamu alaikum to me, or say inshallah, and now specifically these days that seems also common, I'll be honest. But even back in 2005, 2006, whenever it was we premiered and went on, that was very new and very groundbreaking. And at one point on CNN, I remember seeing a news story about our show, which was weird enough, but that the head at that time of like the Muslim American Congress or Muslim American Council or coalition at that point, or Arab American, I forget exactly the title, but it was definitely someone from the Muslim world representing in the North America, saying that this kind of show could do more for Islamic relations in America with folks who aren't Muslim than any kind of peace sort of summit could have done. Mm-hmm. And that was amazing to hear. I don't know if he was right about that, but in many cases, I understand why one could say that, because ultimately we broke records in Canada when we premiered in terms of being a half-hour comedy. In the millions we were viewed, and that wasn't the case not just on the CBC, but in Canadian television in general for shows other than kind of big news shows or sports events. Or kind of American driven content in Canada, but to be domestically created by a Canadian Muslim woman, I mean, this was unheard of and broke the mold, broke the barriers, and broke records. And so I feel like it very much changed the landscape. And now we see so many television shows that have to do with diversity, and even Muslims, like whether it's shows like Rami or other shows. Mo Amer has a show now on Netflix as well. this idea of what it means to be Muslim in an American society. There was a show called Aliens in America. There's the show about the Afghans, the United States of Al, I think, that came out. I mean, these are all shows that are absolutely here now and absolutely relevant, but I'm not sure they would exist if Little Mosque hadn't happened.
Yeah, absolutely. Little Mosque had quite a far reach, like you said, and it was the first of its kind that possibly did change the landscape in a very big way. And I imagine there are many challenges in that in itself, making a show where you're showcasing these different cultures while at the same time ensuring that it's still appealing to the diverse audiences we have in Canada that maybe are only used to seeing a certain type of representation on a platform like CBC. So what were some of the challenges that you came across making a show like Little Mosque?
Well, I think there was some fear, I'll be honest, too, when we first started. We are still, when we started shooting, we were very much, it was still a freshly post 9/11 world. And I mean that when I say that. And obviously 9/11 was a horrific event, one that should never be repeated, and one that was a tragedy for non-Muslims, for sure, but for Muslims as well. And the aftermath of it was also tragic for Muslims because there was a lot of bigotry and racism and Islamophobia. Now, some may call that all justified, but nothing's ever justified when it isn't good. When it's going to take away, when it's going to oppress, when it's going to stereotype, when it's going to be racially or culturally biased, that's never a good thing. And so it was a tragedy, a horrific moment in the history of the world, in the history of the modern world, and it reverberated to Muslims as well, not just the act, but the aftermath of it. And so we were freshly in that time. And so to be doing a show that was going to make fun of, not that, but to make Muslims were not funny. Muslims were not seen as funny people at that time. When you said Muslims, especially around the media, the tone would get very serious. And so to be doing something that was going to make fun of Muslims, kind of including Muslims, I myself am a Muslim, so that also wasn't seen. That idea of Muslims being funny about themselves, Muslims having a sense of humor about themselves, that wasn't an idea that was perpetuated by non-Muslims or Muslims, frankly. Muslims, you didn't really think Muslims wanted to laugh about themselves at that time. But this show, we really tried to make it a show that wasn't about that, but it was just about people. And people are funny, whether they want to be or not. People are stereotypical sometimes, whether they want to be or not. People do make mistakes. People do try to achieve greater things than they can actually attain. And sometimes it's funny. We see that all the time, actually, and we laugh at things all the time. But when it came to Muslims, I think everybody was a little concerned. And so, there was definitely a fear factor, not just a failure, but in fact of for your life in some cases. In some cases, we were, depending on where we were or what period, and this was early on, but I think some of the main cast were concerned and we didn't even want to tell anyone we were doing the show. Not because we didn't know it was going to come out, but we didn't want it to be talked about until it came out, and so that was a very interesting thing to be a part of as well, where you're absolutely trying to be proud of what you're doing, trying to make it absolutely normal, and yet what's around you and the context around you is making you scared to even potentially do it or to admit that you're doing it. And when it came out, it was the opposite. All the fears melted because people were so enthusiastic, so positive about it. And so it didn't matter, like you said, what culture they were. They tended to come up to you and me and say, I relate because of this thing. I relate because of that thing. I met, amazing fans who are part of the Jewish faith, were fans of Little Mosque. And while I was doing Little Mosque in a post 9/11 world, if you told me that would be that would be a reaction, I would say, okay, well, maybe, but I wouldn't believe you necessarily. But when it happens to you, when it doesn't matter what the cultural representation or religious representation of the person, the fan coming up to you, is, but just as I relate to your show, I relate to your, if not character, I relate to your situation. I mean, that's amazing. And then I even met, a young person named Amar who said to me they'd never heard their name on TV, like they'd never seen someone, a little, a young man, a boy. And so to meet those kinds of fans that, were just seeing themselves for the first time, or recognizing themselves, even if I didn't look like them at all, that was very positive. So it was a real nice journey to go from this kind of like, oh my, what's going to happen, to, oh, this has changed the world and I'm now part of it. We're all part of it.
Yeah. No, it really shows you how important this type of positive representation really is to people at an individual level. It's pretty obvious that there has been this kind of multicultural shift in the landscape of Canadian media. And like you mentioned earlier, in the past 2 decades, we've had more and more TV shows and movies they have diverse portrayals. We have Kim's Convenience, we have Rami, like you said, Transplant, Miss Marvel, a new big one. So do you think there are particular factors that are causing this kind of multicultural shift in what the audience wants to see now on screen?
Yeah, I mean, it's a momentum, right? I mean, and I think that you said it. And what's so great is that shows like Transplant and Ms. Marvel, which are seen around the world and seen in the U.S. on a weekly basis, or streamed now. Those are, again, what makes me proud is those are Canadian actors that are portraying these Muslim characters, and it's or different cultured characters, and Kim's Convenience, like you said. Schitt's Creek, even, the idea of LGBTQ2 plus sort of leads on the show, not just making fun of that idea or being shy about it, but just living the stories. And yes, where it's funny, and when it's not funny, it's not funny, and just giving us the authenticity of that idea and the people, the identities of this diverse world that makes us up, and diverse identities that make up the world, that we're able to sort of do that now in a way that we weren't able to do it even, I guess 15 years ago or so, when Little Mosque premiered. It's really gratifying to be part of that journey, and to be in some ways kind of on the early trajectory of that all happening. And now it's just so not common in that it's common, but common because it's so appreciated, so wanted, so desired. As you said, people tune in. These are, now you're not breaking records, or you're setting them for a whole different reasons. Not just because you exist for the first time, but because you're within a landscape of things, and everyone's expecting new things to happen. And so now you have the first Muslim, superhero in the world. I mean, how cool is that? And she happens to be, the person who happened playing her happens to be a Canadian, and that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I would have loved to see that growing up, seeing a Muslim superhero character my
me
age,
too.
growing up as a Pakistani American, Pakistani Canadian. That would have been amazing. But I'm glad that people now get to experience that as well. And I guess
Absolutely.
this makes me wonder, is the definition of Canadian content then changing?
I mean, I think the definition of content is changing, the idea of cultural content in general. But yeah, Canadian content, because I think there was, and there's a whole different conversation going on. Obviously, I happen to be consul general here, so I represent the flags. And I know that in Canada, in terms of, certain policies, what is deemed as Canadian content is a very serious discussion, and that will play out as it's meant to play out. And I look forward to hearing those decisions, based on those policies and those regulators, and even our content creation community in Canada, sort of having that very honest discussion. But I think in a general sense, when we're talking about, what it means to be a content, or to be part of content from a country, yeah, I think Canadian content is not what it used to be. But that's largely because of the people that are part of the community that make up the content. And that's a beautiful thing. That's a positive thing. That's a gain for Canada and its content industry and its content community. It means there's more opportunities for global recognition. There's more opportunities for an awareness globally of what Canada means and what it means to be a Canadian, and who can a Canadian be? Really anybody, clearly. And now that we really have made some strides, and it's just the beginning, clearly, of course, of not just this idea of what it means, like, new Canadians to be, but actually First Nations, Indigenous community members. We're starting to see content and characters and stories driven by our First Nations artists and storytellers. And that is incredibly important to the legacy of what it means to be a country that can tell the story of its people, and the story of its evolution, and the story of who it was, who it wants to be, and who it is, or what it is, or who makes it up. This is incredibly important. And if the full spectrum of your people is not engaged in that, then it's not authentic to yourself. So I think now Canadian content has its greatest chance to be authentically Canadian, to what it means to be Canadian now, which it means everything. It means the entire world and the entire kind of cultural possibility of what that means, whether it's your belief system, whether it's your identity, whether it's your gender, whether it's your philosophy, your religious affiliation. I mean, the fact that we can now really talk about all of that, that to me is the real positive step in what it means to be part of the Canadian content, or what it means to create Canadian content story.
Let's say an ideal world, what would be your ideal project to produce, write, or act in?
I think I'm going to come back to that word authentic, Sameen, that idea of what it means to tell an authentic story, using authentic characters, being in authentic situations. I think that's the kind of project that I would now want to be in, because I understand why back in the day when I was on the show, when it first started, why it was so challenging to make that kind of a show. Even though in a way we did make that kind of a show, we got the best out of our circumstances, and clearly we achieved a lot of greatness with that. And it took everyone. It took the Muslims and the non-Muslims. We were nowhere without each other, I'll be honest. But now where can we go? I would think that you'd want that representation. You'd demand that representation in the room and outside the room, in the corridors of power, and in those showrunner rooms, and in those, when the story gets broken behind the scenes before it's even ever written the episode. Well, who's helping break the story? Who's talking about that? Who are the writers in the room? Who is the showrunner? It would have been amazing if we now live in a world where, if you rewind or sort of do it over again, that Zarka is the showrunner. She creates the show and she's the showrunner. And then there's other writers that she is in charge of hiring, and make sure they could be a mix, because again, the mix is what works too. So you don't want it to be, the whole point is diversity and equity, not homogeny, right? So you'd want people from a mix, but you want the person who's authentically telling the story and authentically who the story is about to be more in charge, I think, than they were and have been in the past. And that's the kind of project or things I'd love to work on with everyone out there who's going to be creating them. That's what I'm looking for, I think, when I'm watching, and that's what I would be looking for when I was an artist in it.
That's beautiful. I think there are many, many stories out there, not just in Canada, but the rest of the world as well. And lots of people wanting to be able to share their stories with the world. So having that authenticity and authentic storytelling, like you said, is really, really important. And we would, of course, love to see any work that you eventually produce or become involved in any way in the future.
That's so kind of you.